We're picking up our reading at 1 Samuel chapter 24. After Saul returned from pursuing the Philistines, he was told, "David is in the desert of En-Gedi." So Saul took 3,000 able young men from all Israel and set out to look for David and his men near the crags of the wild goats. He came to the sheep pens along the way. A cave was there, and Saul went in to relieve himself. David and his men were far back in the cave. The men said, "This is the day the Lord spoke of when he said to you, 'I will give your enemy into your hands for you to deal with as you wish.'" Then David crept up unnoticed and cut off a corner of Saul's robe. Afterward, David was conscience-stricken for having cut off a corner of his robe. He said to his men, "The Lord forbid that I should do such a thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, or lay my hand on him, for he is the anointed of the Lord." With these words, David sharply rebuked his men and did not allow them to attack Saul. And Saul left the cave and went his way. Then David went out of the cave and called out to Saul, "My lord the king." When Saul looked behind him, David bowed down and prostrated himself with his face to the ground. He said to Saul, "Why do you listen when men say David is bent on harming you? This day you have seen with your own eyes how the Lord delivered you into my hands in the cave. Some urged me to kill you, but I spared you. I said, I will not lay my hands on my Lord because he is the Lord's anointed. See, my father, look at this piece of your robe in my hand. I cut off the corner of your robe, but did not kill you. See that there is nothing in my hand to indicate that I'm guilty of wrongdoing or rebellion. I have not wronged you, but you are hunting me down to take my life. May the Lord judge between you and me, and may the Lord avenge the wrongs you have done to me, but my hand will not touch you. As the old saying goes, from evildoers come evil deeds, so my hand will not touch you. Against whom has the king of Israel come out? Who are you pursuing? A dead dog? A flea? May the Lord be our judge and decide between us. May he consider my cause and uphold it. May he vindicate me by delivering me from your hand." When David finished saying this, Saul asked, "Is that your voice, David, my son?" And he wept aloud. "You are more righteous than I," he said. "You have treated me well, but I have treated you badly. You've just now told me about the good you did to me. The Lord delivered me into your hands, but you did not kill me. When a man finds his enemy, does he let him get away unharmed? May the Lord reward you well for the way you treated me today. I know that you will surely be king, and that the kingdom of Israel will be established in your hands. Now swear to me by the Lord that you will not kill off my descendants or wipe out my name from my father's family." So David gave his oath to Saul. Then Saul returned home, but David and his men went up to the stronghold. This is God's word. Now, in case you're wondering, no, this is not the beginning of a new friendship between David and Saul. Saul had said things like this before. He'd say them again, and it's really not going to last. But you really have to wonder, why is Saul so angry? And you can actually go back in the narrative. You can see where this all really got started, where it really took a turn for the worse. It was after David killed Goliath in that spectacular battle, and David was given a high rank in Saul's army. And every time he got sent out on a dangerous mission, he came back successful, which just added to his glory and added to Saul's displeasure with it. But it really got worse when the women started singing this song that was popular and they were dancing to it. And it went like this: Saul has slain his thousands and David his tens of thousands. Now, if you're wondering how Saul felt about that song, it says Saul was very angry. This refrain displeased him greatly. Now, so the simple answer of why Saul was so angry is that he was jealous, right? But I'm not actually sure that just classifying the anger is really enough to help us understand it. The question is really, what is anger? And at its root, it's not about the intensity of emotion or a surge of adrenaline or a particular way that it's expressed, whether it's among us, bitterness or anger, even violence. No matter where anger comes from or how it's expressed, anger at its core is actually pretty simple. It says, I'm against that. Now, there's a counselor and an author named David Powlinson who expressed it this way. He said, anger is active displeasure towards something that's important enough to care about. And he breaks it down a little bit more than that. He says that no matter what type of anger, it always has three main components to it. First, I identify something that I perceive as wrong. I take a stance of disapproval or displeasure, and in some way I move to action, even if it's just by implication or that I might say or do something about it. Now, the reason it's helpful to break it down that way is because that's how it actually points us to solutions. One, you can remove or correct the wrong. You could change your attitude or your judgment about it, or you could distance yourself from it to the point, whether physically or emotionally, to the point that you just don't care about it anymore. Now, that actually holds true whether or not your initial judgment was right. So in other words, anger as an emotion, it's not good or bad in itself. It's a reaction. In fact, it's a very natural one to whatever threatens to hurt or destroy something that you cherish. So whenever a person gets angry about whatever it is, it depends on what it is that they cherish. So it's actually a matter of love. We see that anger and love are very closely connected. So you're not really going to care if something is destroyed if you don't love it. It's not going to matter to you. So now back to the original question, why was Saul so angry? It's because of what he loved. It has everything to do with what he loved. And it seems like what Saul loved the most was being number one. Being in control, having power, being important. And when God told him that he was rejecting him as king because of his wickedness, because of his unfaithfulness, and that his son Jonathan wasn't going to take the throne after him, but David would instead, Saul was furious. And in the 5 chapters between what we read about David and Saul last week, until this point, we can actually see what that anger was doing to Saul. Saul was just unraveling. He was just becoming completely undone by his jealousy. He had used everything at his disposal to try to get rid of David. It started by sending David on increasingly dangerous missions and just hoping that he wouldn't come back. But of course, it backfired because David was under the protection of the Lord, and so everything he did was successful. And so after that, he told his son Jonathan to kill David. And of course, Jonathan was going to do that because by this time, David and Jonathan were best friends. And actually, Saul's daughter, Michal, fell in love with David, which put Saul in kind of a bind because if you remember, he had promised his daughter's hand in marriage to whoever could kill Goliath. So they got married, which, I mean, you can kind of imagine that just makes everything worse for Saul because now it feels like his entire family is turning against him and prefers David. And his rage actually got to a point that it really wasn't tethered to reality anymore. And anyone who had even the slightest appearance of being disloyal to him was considered his enemy. And the most shocking example of that is what he did to the town of Nob. Nob was a town where the tabernacle had been set up. And at one point, David, who was fleeing from Saul, he had no supplies, he didn't have any weapons. He goes to the high priest there and he asked for help. And the high priest gave him bread and he gave him Goliath's sword that he had taken off Goliath's body because David pretended that he was on a secret mission from Saul. Now, when Saul found out about this, he thought the high priest was in on it. And so he came down hard on the town of Nob. He massacred the entire place. He killed 85 priests along with every man and woman and child and infant. He didn't even leave the animals alive. Anger consumed him. He was obsessed. And so for years, David was on the run from Saul, but always narrowly escaping at every turn because he was always under God's protection, which of course means that Saul was never going to get him. There was never a chance that Saul could catch up to David because God had already promised, he had already announced that David would be king. It was just a matter of time. And in our reading, we saw that David had a chance to fast forward to that time. He had the opportunity to end his suffering, end his exile, and end Saul. It happened when he was hiding in a cave, and who would happen to show up right in front of him but his enemy, his persecutor, his tormentor, oblivious to the danger that he was in. So the situation was Saul had likely taken off his robe so it wouldn't get dirty as he squatted down and took care of his business. And David was actually able to sneak up to him and as his men said, deal with Saul as he wished. And I just think about all the reasons David had to do it. Saul had driven him from his home and his family. He had sentenced him to a life living as a fugitive. And if you read on in the next chapter, you find out that in David's absence, Saul took Michal, his daughter, and David's wife, and married her off to another man. That could be a powerful motivator, right? One stroke of the blade, and David could have his old life back. And then doesn't Saul deserve it too, on account of like what he did to the town of Nob? All those people that he had killed, and that cruelty had to be answered. Not to mention all the people that you could potentially be saving if you took out Saul at this moment before his next rampage. Now you could also say, like, for the good of the kingdom, Saul doesn't even seem capable of ruling anymore, does he? He's out here with thousands of soldiers chasing after one man. And David himself made this point to Saul when he confronted him later. He called himself a dead dog, a flea. This is a total waste of resources and a total waste of time to spend it all on a personal vendetta rather than actually seeing to the needs of the people of Israel. So on top of all of that, with Saul out of the way, David had already been anointed as the next king. So if he killed him, he would become king. So he had a lot of reasons to say about Saul, about this whole situation, I am against that. But instead of cutting down Saul, he cut off a little corner of his robe and he let Saul get away. Why? It's because it wasn't God's way. God had put Saul on the throne, and no one but God had the right to remove him. And as we see that David just shows us something really important about angry. It's not that he wasn't angry. He actually was. I mean, look at the way that he dealt with his men immediately after, the ones who tried to convince him that it was God's will, the ones who it seems like they even thought that they themselves would kill Saul after David decided not to. In verse 7 it says, with these words, David sharply rebuked his men and did not allow them to attack Saul. Now, sharply rebuked is kind of a gentle way of translating that. The Hebrew literally says, David tore apart his men with words. He was angry. And it shows what David was for and what David was against. Yes, he was against Saul. He was against what Saul was doing, but he cherished the Lord. Now, some of this seems a little bit counterintuitive, though. Isn't God against Saul? Isn't God against tyranny? Isn't God against slaughter of innocents and self-serving rulers? Well, of course he is, which is why it's so important that God gets to deal with people the way he wants to deal with them. And this is how David confessed it in verse 12. He said, may the Lord judge between you and me. And may the Lord avenge the wrongs you have done to me, but my hand will not touch you. But then, on the other hand, we have to deal with this, the fact that we have a God of vengeance. I mean, isn't he a God of love? There are two really dangerous ways that people tend to misunderstand God. One is to view him as nothing but an angry God who lives for vengeance, who gives laws that we could never live up to, that are impossible to keep, and he judges us against a standard that we'll never be able to meet. And he's just waiting around for us to really mess up so he can come down hard and punish us. Now, the other dangerous misunderstanding is kind of the opposite, the idea that God is closer to, you've maybe heard this before, like a kindly grandfather who smiles and he chuckles about the naughty things we do because, kids will be kids. And then he scoops us up onto his lap and forgets about all the flaws and mistakes. You know what God is really like? He's a God of love, and he's a God of anger. Because you can't really say that you have a God of love if he never gets angry. Because you remember what anger is. It's what happens when someone or something that you love is being threatened. It's actually your anger that shows like nothing else what you love the most. Ephesians 2, we see this, that it actually tells us in the Bible that we are by nature deserving of wrath. It means that every one of us comes into this world born under a threat because our natural state is for us to be against God. But because he's a God of infinite love and unfailing love, he was angry about the sin that threatens and corrupts and destroys what he loves. And so that's why he sent his son Jesus, the son of David. And you know Jesus actually got angry sometimes? You know what really set Jesus off? Religious people who use God's laws to oppress and harm. Jesus got angry when his disciples tried to keep the little children away from him. Jesus got angry when people turned the temple into a marketplace and took away other people's opportunity to worship. Jesus got angry at death. Jesus got angry at anything that would threaten to keep the ones he loves away from him. And so just like his ancestor David, he opposed it. He did something about it, but he gave it to his father to avenge the wrong. But unlike David, and better than David, what Jesus did is he actually allowed himself to be captured by his enemies, who took to be slaughtered by them, to be treated as an enemy of God the Father, who took all that wrong, all that evil, all that wickedness, and collected it up into one spot and put it on his son Jesus on the cross and destroyed it. It's his anger that shows what he loves most, what he treasures, and that's you and me. And then he rose to prove the point that there is now no condemnation for those who are in him, no more wrath and no more anger. And there's actually going to be a time when there will be no more anger at all. Because remember at the beginning, he talked about what anger is, and it begins with identifying something that you perceive as wrong. And when Jesus finally comes back, he's going to deal with everything that he is against, conflict and oppression and even death, and he's going to take us to heaven where there is going to be nothing left to be angry about, nothing left to oppose, because there's going to be nothing wrong, nothing that threatens to destroy us, and nothing that's left to keep us away from Jesus. Now, this is Christian Education Weekend, and I haven't talked about education at all. So what does all this have to do with Christian education? Well, I'll tell you this account about David, it's not in the Bible so that we can take comfort in how great David was and feel secure in how much like him we can learn to be. And I want to show you one of the things that God did to prepare David for this temptation. It's just a few verses from the end of our first reading. This is 1 Samuel 23, starting at verse 15. While David was at Horish in the desert of Ziph, he learned that Saul had come out to take his life. And Saul's son, Jonathan, went to David at Horish and helped him find strength in God. "Don't be afraid," he said. "My father Saul will not lay a hand on you. You will be king over Israel, and I will be second to you. Even my father Saul knows this." See, Saul couldn't find David out in the wilderness, and it doesn't actually tell us how Jonathan was able to find him, or how difficult the journey was, or how much it cost him, but it does tell us why Jonathan went, to help him find strength in God. He didn't come to give him good advice. He didn't come to tell him everything was going to be okay, and it's actually really beautiful the way it's written in Hebrew. It literally says that Jonathan made strong his hand in God. In other words, it's as if he took David's hand and he put it into God's hand. Now, what Jonathan was saying to him here, it's not prophecy. And we know that because he wasn't actually entirely right. He was right that Saul wouldn't lay a hand on him. He was right that David would be king over Israel. But he was wrong that Jonathan would one day be second in command, because Jonathan actually died in battle before that could happen. So what's so encouraging about this? I'm sure it was great to see his friend maybe one last time, but that's not the sort of encouragement that lasts. What did Jonathan do? All he did was repeat God's promises back to him, so that when the time came that David was tempted, tempted to take a shortcut, tempted to end his suffering, tempted to willfully interpret the circumstances, to justify what he really wanted to do, to let his feelings guide his actions. David was able to put all his trust in God and to wait on his timing. Now, I want you to imagine like you're in your growth groups this week or your morning circle or wherever it is that you gather with other Christians, and you're going around the circle and people are making prayer requests. And one person says, I'd like to ask God to make me more patient. And someone else says, my sister's in the hospital, I'm praying for healing for her. And others facing maybe an uncertain work situation, so God, give me peace and guidance. And it comes to the last person and they say, God, I want you to make me angry. God, I want you to help me to put more rage and fury in my prayers. Have you ever prayed like that? We're not praying for a selfish anger or a toxic anger or a self-righteous anger or anything that's going to tempt us to take shortcuts to our own version of justice. That's the kind of anger that we're asking God to protect us from. But what we're not going to do is go so far in the other direction away from anger to the point that we just don't care about things at all. Because to not be angry at all can actually be a problem. Because it might mean that we're not caring enough about the things that God cares about. What we're asking for from God is a fierce, protective anger that mirrors God's own holy and righteous anger over anything that threatens what he loves. And yet our anger is going to give up any right of vengeance to him and trust in his wisdom and in his timing, which ironically gives us a greater peace than anything that this world can actually give. And so this is our charge, and it's true for all of us today, but today we're saying it especially to educators and those who are committed to doing this work, discipling children here at St. Marcus. Learn to cherish what God cherishes, and learn to be against whatever he is against, whether you find it out there or in here. And take the hands of the children that you serve and put them in God's hands to help them find strength in God by repeating his promises to them. And teachers, God bless you for the ways that you're already doing that now. The ways you're preparing them for the battles that are to come, and you're leading them to Jesus, who loves them even more than you do, because he paid an unspeakable cost so that there would be nothing that could keep them away from him. Let's pray. Dear Father, you so loved the world that you gave your Son to be the object of your anger, of your wrath, and to give us your peace and set us free. Now continue to give us grace to really understand what Jesus did, to give us strength for our own battles, and that it would change us and empower us to lead more people to you. In Jesus' name, amen. This time I'll invite